Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Holding Redlink Lawyers, where we are present tonight physically. Only limited numbers allowed, unfortunately, due to COVID restrictions. But welcome to those who are here in person, and welcome also to our listeners online, wherever they might be within Queensland or anywhere else. First of all, can I introduce myself as Paul Lucas? I'm the Queensland Branch President of the Institute of International Affairs. Can I acknowledge the traditional owners, the Yagara and the Turrbal people of the land on which we meet, and acknowledge their elders, both past and emerging. Issue, well, I suppose it's confounding for many in the federal government, issue in relation to climate change, but I'll just read the abstract for you first. The government is under significant, arguably unprecedented pressure regarding its position on climate change. Domestically, opinion polls have demonstrated growing concern about the issue over time, not least in the wake of the devastating bushfires of 2019-20. Internationally, Australia's minimal greenhouse reduction ambition, refusal to commit to a target for achieving net zero emissions, and continued commitment to fossil fuel exports have been challenged by key allies, by Pacific neighbours, and even by growing trends in the global economy. Australia's climate policy, it would seem, is increasingly at odds with public opinion, our reputation, our key foreign policy goals, and given our economic bottom line. And even our economic bottom line. With COP26 in the UK on very shortly, this presentation examines whether the Morrison Government is currently experiencing a perfect storm of pressure on climate policy, challenging the legitimacy of its policy priorities and suggesting the possibility of policy change. Matt McDonald, our esteemed speaker tonight, is an associate professor in international relations in the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland. He teaches and researches in Australian foreign policy and international security, and more specifically, the politics and security implications of climate change. He has published widely in these areas and is the author of Security, the Environment and Emancipation, co-author of Ethics in Global Security and Ecological Security. He is currently undertaking an ARC-funded research project on comparative national responses to the relationship between climate change and national security. Matt will speak to us tonight. He has a presentation to give us, and at the conclusion of his speech, we'll take questions both online and from the audience. So if you are online, please start thinking of those questions and send them through whenever you like, and we'll ask them of Matt at the end of the contribution tonight. Over to you, Matt.
Thank you very, very much, Paul. Thank you very much, Sir Paul Lucas, for that wonderful, very generous introduction, and for all the work, I should say, on behalf of my school and my institution at UQ, the wonderful work he does with our programs and our students. Our students there, we do very much appreciate it. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we're gathered, whether at home or present. So one of the recent publications that Paul mentioned is a book that was published about a week ago, actually, Ecological Security. And I have been doing this frustrating virtual book tour where I've been presenting to audiences in Norway, in Sweden, in Thailand, in Turkey, in the United States, and the United Kingdom. Many of whom are kind enough to tell me that they would happily have flown me over for those events had it not been for COVID. So it's very nice to actually present in person somewhere, albeit on a topic that's actually closer to the type of topic that I tend to write op-eds about and tend to engage a bit more in public debate about, which is Australia's climate politics and climate policy specifically. Given that this is an AAAA event and the focus is broadly international, obviously climate change is an international issue, but for that reason, I'll focus just a little bit more today on the international dimensions of Australia's approach, in particular its approach to climate diplomacy and some of the broader challenges in the international terms of dealing with the challenge of climate change. I won't spend a long time going through climate change, how we know it's happening, how we know it's human-induced, and what some of the effects of climate change actually are in practice. I think we can leave a lot of that as taken, especially given that even in some of the more conservative recent political interventions we've seen from even Donald Trump, found it increasingly difficult to actually challenge the science of climate change itself. For all the other things he seemed to be willing to challenge, it seems that as though it's emerged as one of those issues that it's really difficult now to challenge the idea that it's happening, that it's human-induced, and that some of the effects that are listed there will be really incredibly significant and damaging, especially to the most vulnerable. But of course, in policy terms, it is a wicked policy problem. There are a range of ways that climate change is an incredibly challenging policy issue to deal with. One that's substantively different from a parallel example that's often drawn is the ozone layer. The response that was the Montreal Protocol to address the hole in the ozone layer, to ban chlorofluorocarbons. You had there a simple sort of immediate solution that actually you could address without necessarily having significant and damaging changes to economies. You had readily available alternative technologies you could draw on. Climate change is fundamentally different in a range of ways. Of course, first of all, climate change is genuinely transnational. So state action alone, no matter how consequential that state, no matter how significant its actual contribution to climate change is, state action alone is not enough, which means you need some form of collaboration and cooperation to deal with the problem. There's also in that context the relative versus absolute gains problem. This is something we talk about in international nations theory. This challenge of states recognising the possibility that they can actually benefit through working together to address this problem, rather than, as some approaches would suggest, they would necessarily have to cheat as much as possible to try to address those problems, to try to maintain or develop their own advantage relative to other states. So the danger here is the sort of free rider problem, if you like, the danger that a state like Australia might say, it looks all too difficult for us to sacrifice immediate economic growth, but actually we benefit from the broader efforts of the rest of the world to address the problems of climate change. So the massive advantage that we can develop is through doing very, very little ourselves, but benefiting from a better environment. This is one of the other challenges of that. And someone like Garrett Hardin in 1968 developed this idea of the tragedy of the commons, that necessarily when you have areas that aren't entirely controlled by one sovereign state, they will necessarily be exploited at an increasingly advanced rate once those resources are seen as being particularly important. So this could be applied to the atmosphere, obviously in the context of climate change, but also to oceans, to the Arctic or the Antarctic, for example. There's also the ethical complexities that are incredibly, that keep a lot of political philosophers off the streets, in employment, but also up nights trying to work out how you actually mediate between lots of different competing claims. And one of the really fascinating things I think about climate change and the responses to it is when you look at these problems, you see key axes of debate within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change itself. You see states debating on precisely these issues. So these are things like the right to development, the rights of developing states to say, well, you, the developed world, achieved your level of economic growth through the exploitation of the environment, through rapid levels of industrialisation that involve significant greenhouse gas emissions. Surely it's not fair for you to deprive us of the opportunity to do that. And this has particular purchase in countries like India, countries like Brazil, and countries like China, big emitters and increasingly large emitters who are trying to transition from being developing states to states with a significant middle class, with significant levels of development. Related to this are historical emissions arguments that states in the developed world might say, well, yes, we did develop in that way, but if we had only known we would have chosen a different pathway. If we didn't know in the 1960s and 1970s that this form of economic growth that was very much tied to the fossil fuel economy was going to create these types of environmental problems. Surely our fault is less than those who now know that they are contributing to the problem of climate change. That's another really tricky issue. Then we get to questions of what obligations, if any, do we have to future generations or indeed to other living beings who are acutely vulnerable to the effects of climate change, but of course aren't really thinking about that response. Let's have recognition that some states are acutely vulnerable, and obviously here we were talking about the single island states who are existentially vulnerable to the problem of climate change in the sense of sea level rise. But contrast that with the experience of states like Russia, for example, might actually have an increase in their availability of arable land associated with the effects of climate change. We might even hear talk about the preservation of culture or identity, whether it's those in Argentina who think actually part of our way of life is access to red meat, or those in the United States who think part of our way of life is access to really, really big vehicles that use a lot of gasoline. All of these sort of challenges, the latter less so, but these are broad ethical challenges about how to then get from this position of there are multiple states with multiple different sets of vulnerabilities to the problem of climate change, radically different sets of contributions to the problem itself, and significantly different levels of vulnerability to its effects. All those things put together in terms of their capacity to respond as well. You have this really challenging set of circumstances of trying to adjudicate between what's appropriate in terms of response. And these types of questions have been central to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change debates. Indeed, there's also problems of uncertainty here, not so much about whether climate change is real, whether it's human-induced, or what effects it will have, but about timeframes and severities that create just enough ambiguity, often for states to basically say, well, are we really going to sacrifice our economy over the next 5 to 10 years? This is obviously relevant to a country like Australia, to transition away from fossil fuels when we don't know for sure whether we'll see these big tipping points, like the slowing down of the Atlantic current, like the death of the Amazon rainforest, like these sorts of large scale tipping point events that people refer to here. So the regime of climate change itself, so Stephen Krasner, an international relations theorist, talks about a regime as a set of principles, norms, rules, and decision-making procedures around which actor expectations converge in a given issue area. So we might talk about the refugee regime, for example, or the human rights regime. Central to those are key things like the Refugee Convention, Declaration of Human Rights, for example. Similarly, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is central to the climate change regime, but it's not reducible to it. There's a set of expectations and practices around it. So the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, is of course the central international instrument for dealing with climate change. It was established at the so-called Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. Since then, we've seen a series of Conference of the Party meetings where essentially all states get together to talk about the response to climate change. But there's been a few that have been particularly consequential. COP3 in Kyoto led to the Kyoto Protocol, the first international agreement on climate change and responses to it, where developed states agreed to an average emissions reduction of 5.2% from 1990 levels by this target period, 2008-2012. Of course, Australia managed to negotiate an 8% increase from 1990 levels. We'll circle back to that in just a moment. COP15 in Copenhagen was also really significant for Australian policy in the sense that in the case of COP15, we saw no agreement on what that commitment after Kyoto would be. We saw some movement on things like funds transfers, but ultimately it was seen as by and large a failure. And this ended up being really consequential for the Rudd government. It was sort of his last ditch attempt to try to help justify the carbon pollution reduction scheme, if there was a sense of a really strong international agreement at Copenhagen, it would have helped his case domestically to push hard for strong domestic action. And that's one of the fascinating things about climate change as an issue, especially in countries like Australia. Ultimately, it can be depressing. The intersection between the domestic and the international is quite telling in this context. And then, of course, Paris. And these photos, I should note, were taken by me as one of the observers in Paris in 2015. I was fortunate enough to be there. Paris saw internal targets that were going to be ratcheted up every 5 years. So the idea was we learned from the mistakes of Copenhagen, where they tried to set specific targets for states, and we say, let's just get states to articulate their own targets. Everyone gets inside the tent, and then each 5 years ratchet up those commitments, which is precisely why Glasgow is so important, because it's the point where those states are committing to these increased levels of ambition associated with their emissions reduction targets. So it's now enforced. The big question is, how much will we see action in advance of Glasgow? Lots of states have already declared their hand. Of course, Australia hasn't, in the sense of ratcheting up targets. We're dealing with the same ones. Will we see things like more funds for climate transitions? That's what questions. So to pivot back to Australia, Australia is among, of course, the highest per capita emitters of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. It's also among the world's largest exporter of coal. It tends to go back and forth between Indonesia and Australia. Incidentally, not the largest producer of coal by any stretch. China is the largest producer of coal, but uses all of that coal itself to fund its own rapid levels of economic development and industrialisation. One interesting point about this is that neither the Paris Agreement nor the Kyoto Protocol before it included coal exports as part of a calculation of how much countries actually contribute to the problem of climate change. So Australia, when you start to take that into account, it's one of the most common arguments you have in this context as well. Australia is not a massive contributor to global climate change. Should we really, be down on ourselves about the level of ambition relative to other states? I wrote an op-ed about how to respond specifically to this argument that Australia contributes. So that, one of the points, which is that actually, if you take our coal exports into consideration, our contribution to climate change increases significantly. The IPCC noted in 2007, noted the level of vulnerability that Australia had to effects of climate change. Australia, of course, particularly affected by things like severe weather events, droughts, bushfires. The Climate Commission was pushing this line strongly, but Australia has played, as we probably know, this changing position. It's been a prominent player, but sometimes as an advocate for strong action, really pushing hard for strong action on climate change, more often as a state that's been at the lower end of ambition, to the point under Howard where it was actually undermining the possibility of international agreement issue. So very early on in its foreign policy, the Australian government under Labor, under Bob Hawke, and then less so, but still under Paul Keating, led the commitment to climate action in the lead up to the Rio Summit. It was pushing hard. Australia at this point, it seems hard to imagine now, but was pushing really hard for specific target commitments of reduction from different states in the international system. It was early days. And in fact, in 1988, had the interim planning target for emissions that was above almost every other state for politics. So you've come from this position of strength. And some would say this is as much about this idea associated with Gareth Evans, the international citizenship in Australian context. This was then followed with under the Howard government. Australia generally seemed to be an impediment to collaboration and cooperation and strong action on climate change in the context of negotiations of the Kyoto Protocol. We saw very limited domestic action, but Australia gained a lot of concessions at the Kyoto Protocol, like the allowance to actually increase emissions in the target period, in part through the recognition that this was a consensus-based agreement. So they basically said, look, we'll walk away if we don't have our particular circumstances acknowledged. And of course, a range have basically said this was tied, a range of analysts have said this was tied to the significant power of fossil fuel lobby groups in the Australian context, pushing green action issue. The ALP then under Rudd, of course, came to power, the great moral challenge of climate change. So we know this was one of the issues. And in fact, some say this was the sort of climate position. But of course, we saw in many ways, we saw this gap, if you like, between the level of international discussion and effort around this issue on one hand, and substantive domestic action on the other, right? This was almost inverted under the Gillard government when we did see significant breakthroughs in terms of the passage of the so-called carbon tax, but at the same time, Gillard emphasised this less at the international level. There was less pageantry around it, but more substantive policy change. Then, of course, we saw Tony Abbott elected in 2013. The repeal of the carbon tax was the first order of government. And while he made the case that the 2013 election would be a referendum on carbon tax, that's not really how that particular election played out. But more importantly, he was responsible then for articulating Australia's position in the lead up to the Paris Agreement. We saw limited domestic action. The direct action plan involved significant subsidies for fossil fuel industries if they agreed to reduce their emissions, and continually under rising emissions. Of course, current climate policy, many saw the 2019 election as one in which we would see climate change play a central role. And of course, the infamous now Adani convoy has gone into folklore as one of the key sort of representations, if you like, of the election. Most recent analyses that I've seen electoral politics and that election suggests that it played less of a role than the climate policy played less of a role. Things like taxation reform policy, but nonetheless. So under the current government, we've seen no new reduction commitments. We've seen no timetable for net zero emissions, significant subsidisation of the fossil fuel sector. The IMF suggests that's up to about $10 billion. We have seen some reductions at different points in our greenhouse gas emissions, but the general consensus is almost none of this is related to federal government policy, that it's related to things like land use changes, so the reduction in land clearing that is largely legislated at the state level rather than at the federal level. And I'm going to sound like a total climate policy nerd on this question, but that's actually why the federal government set the target date from 2005. It's precisely to try to get the point where that peaked and then capture some of the reduction that had very little to do with federal government policy. Related to that, a lot of the reductions we've seen have been associated with state policy, not just on land use, in fact, principally in states like Victoria and New South Wales as well, energy policy. And then the effects of COVID-19 have slowed down transportation and the contribution that sector makes to climate change. So we've seen some reduction, but always none related to the policy instruments and levers of the federal government. But so far, this pressure has led not to change targets and not to a commitment to achieving net zero by a particular point, but rather to new forms of technology and infrastructure funding, like clean hydrogen, which is contentious, but also carbon capture and storage arrangements, lots of money for that, money for resilience building programs. We saw the abandonment of the use of Kyoto credits. So because Australia's baseline of the Kyoto Agreement was so low, we were actually overachieving on that. So we're allowed an 8% increase. And so there was for a long time, the Morrison government was suggesting we'll actually use that to meet our Paris targets. They've abandoned that, but again, most of these types of things, not necessarily the effects of their own policy. But, and this is where we get to the sort of nub of what I've suggested speaking to today, and that's the question of whether we are now reaching something of a perfect storm in climate policy for this particular government in terms of its sustainability, not in terms of the environmental sustainability of its climate policy, because it's not sustainable environmental grounds, but whether it's actually politically sustainable now, its current policy settings. So, of course, at one level, on every ranking, Australia does very, very bad. We haven't set a net zero emissions target, unlike almost all comparable states that have set that by 2050. And even China, as we know, the world's largest and most significant growing emissions sort of origin state, has set a net zero emissions target by 2060, but not us. And this is one of those things where I think actually this looks like, and I had an op-ed published fairly recently on the National saying this is a no-brainer that you would support net zero emissions, and yet even that seems contentious in the Australian context. Emissions reduction targets, Australia has not ramped up its emissions reduction targets since the Paris Agreement. We've seen significant efforts and articulation of new measures by the US, by the EU, the UK, Canada. By contrast, Australia is running with the same numbers that Tony Abbott articulated in 2015. The Green Climate Fund, which is an international fund to try to facilitate the transfer of resources to enable developing countries to transition their economy away from fossil fuels and to protect themselves from some of the effects of climate change. Australia is the only developed state not committed to that actual fund at the moment. A lot of it, it says, is because they, for bilateral aid, or its own sort of articulation of where that aid should go, but nonetheless, alongside all the other things, not a particularly good look for Australia. The IPCC has said Australia's targets are inconsistent with even the 2-degree goal. Climate Action Tracker suggests that our commitments are highly insufficient. More directly, a UN report saying Australia is last at the back of the pack of 193 countries, and a climate change performance index from 2020 had Australia second last, but only because the Trump administration was withdrawing at that point from the Paris Agreement and from the Convention on Climate Change. So, in terms of global pressure, we've seen criticism of Australia from a range of diplomats, the UN Secretary General coming out and suggesting that Australia is out of step with comparable nations. Australia was, of course, denied a speaking slot at the 2020 Climate Summit. At the virtual summit we saw in 2021, the UK, the US, and the chair of COP26 were all critical of Australia. Indeed, the chair of COP26 has come out today saying that actually he thinks that Australia double its emissions reduction commitments. And Biden's election is utterly crucial, not just because Biden, I think for two reasons. First, of course, Biden is really keen on this issue and keen on promoting action on climate change generally. But second, and in my view, far more important, is that with Trump gone, you now lose this sort of sense that Australia wasn't the prior in international climate terms. You used to be able to, in Australia's context, to say, okay, we're not doing as much as some other countries, but at least we're still in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. At least we're still in Paris. You know, now, having lost that, Australia is suddenly massively exposed. And the sort of countries that we're affiliated with when it comes to climate action are countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, not exactly climate champions. And that is where I think the election of Biden is as crucial as anything else, less his agenda and more just that it's not Trump's. There are also substantive implications for Australia in terms of its foreign policy and diplomatic interests, in terms of its claimed commitment to the Pacific step up, engaging countries of the Pacific who have consistently said to Australia, don't worry so much about giving us an aid to address climate change. How about do something about your specific contribution to the problem? For them, this is existential. Pacific Islands Forum in 2019 was incredibly fractious, and Scott Morrison, by the time he came back, looked harried and really under significant pressure from the leaders of the region. And this is a point where you think, actually, Australia has said we are really interested in ramping up engagement with the region, and yet our position on climate policy really undermines that foreign policy goal. There's also, of course, the EU trade, both the trade agreement that now looks even sort of less like the French sort of throwing some toys out of the cart in terms of the most recent subs deal, but also, so there is the trade deal, but which Australia presents that involves significant levels of carbon emissions in terms of production. The EU was concerned about loss of economic revenue as much as anything else. This is one of those other things where actually market forces are meeting political objectives to suggest that actually Australia is really under the gun on this particular issue. The Quad talks have now evolved to talk about climate cooperation. And then, of course, when we get to coal projects and the broader market signals around fossil fuels in Australia, they are not good. So this perfect storm extends as well to the domestic context. Public opinion suggests that the public overwhelmingly support a net zero target. They overwhelmingly support stronger targets. And in 2019, admittedly just before COVID really started to hit, climate change was represented by Australians as the most pressing threat to Australia's national interest. In electoral terms, the big issue for the Morrison government is, of course, the threat to inner city seats. So while you have the Nationals, who are, of course, sort of happily people like Matt Canavan, like Pitt, really focusing on their constituency, wanting to die on the particular hill of any action on climate change. There are real threats to inner city seats held by Liberal Party members associated with their position on climate change. The Abbott effect is represented this, of course, in Warringah. There are bigger concerns that we might see more of the type of climate disasters, climate-induced disasters that we did with the bushfires in 2019-20, that this might push further for domestic action. Even pressure from traditional supporters in the business sector. So Fortescue Metals, Twiggy Forrest, making the case that Australia should not keep investing in these so-called alternative clean versions of gas, hydrogen, but basically should start to transition away from fossil fuels. And yes, there's all sorts of very good reasons to be cynical about what his agenda in that context is, but what it speaks to is this gap between increasingly the Australian government was able to say, or tried to continually run with the line that it's either protection of the environment or jobs in the economy. Now that jobs in the economy looks weaker and weaker with each passing month, where all the international market signals are pointing away from traditional versions of fossil fuels, all pointing towards an investment in renewables, all suggesting we need to make the decision now to transition our economy and our energy sector away, because if we don't, it's going to cost us a lot more in the future. States are ahead of the government on targets and transition. So Victoria and New South Wales outlining quite ambitious targets. Of course, Queensland got up its land clearing sort of legislation, and that was really significant as well. We've seen figures in the Australian Defence Force saying, let's recognise something with security implications in climate change, something I've been working on recently. The ALP at the federal level has been more progressive, but we've also seen a more muted response to the government position. And perhaps this tells us all we need to know about just how toxic the politics of climate change has been in Australia over the past 10, 15, even potentially 20 years. And there's a sense that now that governments are desperate, governments and opposition are as keen to present themselves not as leaders on this particular issue, but as small a target as possible on that particular issue. And that, for those of us interested in leadership on this, is particularly problematic. My favourite picture there, of course, of Barnaby Joyce staring at an alpaca, stunned by what he said. Well, I don't know who has a fake face in that particular image, but there's all sorts of ways in which, as someone writing about climate policy, climate politics for a while, I've learned to be circumspect about predictions of how things are going to play out. What I do think is that the government's position at the moment is unsustainable. I do think we will get some type of change and announcement over the next few weeks, probably a commitment to net zero emissions, maybe an increase in target, but whether that will be enough to assuage the concerns of those who are interested and the forces of pressure that we'll see in Australia, like continued pressure in the lead up to Glasgow and even beyond if there's a strong and robust commitment. Electoral concerns that the Morrison government might have, because if they run with current policy, the best they can do on climate change is retain some of those seats that they managed to hold in Queensland, for example. What they will be putting under pressure is their capacity to actually sustain some of those seats that they have in the inner city parts of Melbourne, Sydney in particular. How intransigent will the Nationals be on this particular issue? I think their politics around this has been just absolute. Even as someone who would suggest themselves as a political advisor, I think the politics on this has been just woefully misunderstood and mismanaged, because net zero seems like a no-brainer to me, but they've dug themselves into a massive hole by saying, we want to see a plan. Without a plan, it means nothing, which of course now the obvious concession is we can commit to net zero and not necessarily have to do anything for the next 10 years, which is essentially the sort of political life of most of the people in those rooms. But they've actually deprived themselves of the capacity to do that by saying our opposition is about the absence of a broader plan to do that. So just how intransigent the National be is a big question. How much people are still spooked by climate politics as it played out over the last couple of decades, economic prospects and the change in market demand for non-fuel renewables, increasing severe weather events, the interests of other important parties to Australia and important allies, how COVID plays out, whether we'll see a renewed focus on climate, say, in the lead up to the next election as things start to settle down with COVID, or will it be an election about the government's handling of the coronavirus? And then public attitude. So one of the challenges that I touched on that you see in this particular Lowy poll, one thing that's really frustrating and telling is that public support for strong action is strong when governments aren't doing much on climate change. But when they are, this is when the carbon tax came into effect. And it's at that point that support for strong action on climate change dropped significantly. So does that tell us something about how climate change can be politicised, or does it tell us something about the Australian public broadly being fickle on this particular issue? Can we escape the toxic politics of climate change? And if so, I think those at home and those in front of me will be able to tell me how. Thanks for that.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much, Matt. Wonderful contribution, as you all would have expected. So brilliant. Those of you in the ether, if you could be thinking up your questions, and of course in the audience here, I'll get you to be thinking up yours, but the prerogative of the chair is always to ask the first one. And so my first one relates to Australia's international reputation. As a country, we're a middle power. We've never had great military might to be able to exercise our influence beyond our shores, so we've had to rely on soft power. Australia has always done extremely well in international forums. We sought to and achieved positions on the Security Council. We recently had Matthias Cormann go to the OECD. What evidence is there, though, that our negative perceptions as a result of climate change recalcitrance is likely then to sheet home to Australia not being able to get positions on international bodies or exert its influence for a country that soft power is so much, and diplomacy is so much of our influence and our positive influence overseas?
Well, thanks so much for that, Paul. It's such a big question. One of the real challenges in this context is actually linking in some ways the position that we have on climate change to outcomes like how likely would it be in this context if Australia was putting its name up for a UN Security Council rotating seat, how likely would it be that we would get up at the moment in the context of climate policy? I think this government has read the international room really badly on the issue of climate change and has underestimated just how the significant issue in interpretation for most countries in the world, really, in terms of that response, especially the types of states that Australia wants to engage with, and has traditionally tried to use sort of with. So in the Pacific context, we're already seeing diplomatic implications associated with some states being more likely to entertain advanced regime, for example, than might otherwise have been the case in the past, but also just direct pushback on the idea of increased levels of bilateral cooperation that have focused significantly on the question of climate change. And that's, I think, again, through the looking glass, I think what we will see is more and more over time, more and more measures that are shifting from, it would be nice if you guys could commit to doing more on climate change to, well, you've been warned, here are some broadly coercive mechanisms. And I think the EU's border sort of carbon tax may not have been motivated by let's punish Australia, but it's had that effect. And I think we'll see more and more of those types of instruments over time where we see direct foreign policy and economic policy implications for Australia if it continues to sustain its current position on climate change. One of the reasons I think it is an unsustainable position.
Well, perhaps just to comment on that, Australia, and one thing about mining is it will not cease even if we don't have any coal. And Australia has always benefited and will benefit even more for the actions the EU is taking on ESG and world companies requiring ESG. If we don't do the E properly, we can be all the best at S&G, and our great advantage over many other parts of the world in being able to satisfy those issues in mining will evaporate. So questions from the room?
The rumour seems to be growing strong that the Prime Minister is not even going to attend the conference being held in Glasgow next month. What sort of signal does that send to the rest of the world?
A terrible one, especially because it's funny, I was asked for a media comment on this today, so I should be able to answer this particular question. In the past, of course, Australian Prime Ministers haven't necessarily attended, of course, all the conferencing party meetings, but the big ones, by and large, they have. And when John Howard didn't go to Kyoto in 1997 and sent Environment Minister Robert Hill, that was seen as a big message. When Tony Abbott came into power and didn't send a minister at all to the first conference of the party, that sent a big message about Australia's response. So I think there was, I would have to say, in terms of Morrison's calculations, I think there are probably two factors that are going to be really significant for him. One will be how much does the necessity of 2 week, or possibly if he gets his way, only 1 week quarantining, not being on the campaign trail, how much does that hit me in the lead up to the next federal election? I honestly think he would be thinking about that. And Catherine Murphy, who seems much smarter than me, she thinks that as well. I think the other issue is if he is unable to convince the Nationals to get on board with at least net zero, but probably also a greater commitment in terms of our NDC, our national external contribution, I think he would recognise that he would be going to that event to get pilloried and to get hammered by all the other states involved, like the Pacific Islands for 2019. And why you can manage that if you are the sort of regional power and there's only a handful of other states. If you're significantly the foreign guy for basically almost everyone else of that conference, that starts to look really bad. So I think in some ways, I think you're right, it will be a really bad look, but I think in his case, the worst thing would be to go if you haven't managed to ramp up your commitments. So that's probably the challenge he faces.
The International Energy Agency is saying that if we get carbon neutral by 2050, you can't have any more coal mines and gas production until it's coming on the street. So I'm just curious that this fact hasn't seemed to surface in Australia. The government doesn't seem to take a hold of this fact. And there are a plethora of new gas fields and coal mines coming down the stream. So I'm just wondering whether it's a service. But secondly, I'm wondering whether, with all this rash of advertisements about cool and green gas, whether the battle is not so much between the government and public opinion, but the government and the flow of money from the gas line industry.
So on the first point, it is, I mean, Susan Ley today announced government approval for a new coal mine just outside Muswellbrook, so which is part of the world I was originally from. When you go to the Hunter now, it's unrecognisable from where it was when I was growing up as a kid. You know, the scale of sort of effect that it's had on that environment and the way it's changed is just. It's spectacular to the difference, but you're absolutely right that I think essentially this is a government that is thinking in very much in terms of a short term. I would think the best case scenario is that you have governments thinking about 5 years into its economic future. I suspect what you're thinking about is a government that's thinking about 12 months into its political future and the possibility of let's minimise losing any of these seats. Let's try to get seats that we might otherwise have lost associated with the mining sector and the mining industry. It is a really challenging and complicated space when you start to go deep on energy policy. And of course, Malcolm Turnbull found that out with the National Energy Guarantee that really was a fairly mainstream response that ended up being one of those things that led to his demise the second time around. Some forms, there's recognition that some of these forms of new forms of energy production in terms of clean hydrogen have capacity, but there's also significant levels of infrastructure investment in the first instance. And you just think, why aren't we just throwing the kitchen sink at renewables in a country like Australia? It doesn't make financial sense. Similarly, carbon capture and storage looks good because we have all these coal mines, so let's just get them to not emit as many emissions as they did, or let's minimise how many make it into the atmosphere. But of course, this is also just a massive bone thrown to the fossil fuel industry, because it's saying to them, it's business as usual, we'll just throw some extra money at you to help you minimise how much you actually emit in the process. So I think that's one space. The energy sector at the moment is one space where you're right to be incredibly cynical about how the government is viewing that issue. It's not thinking long-term economic. It's not thinking long-term in terms of even particular constituencies. And this is, I think, my massive grievance with the National Party at the moment. It's having grown up as in a regional part of Australia, to see that abrogation of responsibility to farmers who are just going to be so disproportionately affected by the effects of climate change. It's really hard one to swallow.
Of course, one of the, as a comment, one of the really interesting things that I can remember in my time, my previous job, is that technology has changed very significantly. The McKinsey greenhouse cost abatement curve for Australia, when it started, the only areas that, even if you didn't believe in climate change, you'd be mad if you didn't invest in energy efficiency, was transport and building. But the curve has shifted massively in relation to energy generation. The cost of green generation has just plummeted. Big challenge now, of course, is not energy generation, really, it's energy storage, shifting time of day, shifting place where energy is consumed. We've got some questions online.
So, it's a question from Timothy Florin. It's based on your previous one. I'll just read it out. You outlined very thoroughly why CC is a political storm for Australia, climate change. Would you like to comment on whether it might also be a political storm for other countries? Example, UK, Boris-led Red Wall might turn to Gillett Jonas, or USA, not all Americans agree with John Kerry.
So I think the UK. So I would often say one of the things about I thought. I confess I had some and still have this slight tinge of hope when it comes to Morrison and climate policy. Yes, he's the one who went into Parliament with the lump of coal. But unlike Tony Abbott and John Pink wants to stay in power. I'm not sure that there's that same desperation to see the sustenance of that particular industry that you would have with someone like Abbott, who just would have gone to the wall against it no matter what the polling was telling him. So for that reason, I think it's, this, to circle back to that question, one of the things that I think was always a massive advantage for the UK and for Germany, for example, is that you had conservatives who were pushing strong action on climate change. And when that happens, when it stops being politicised, when it starts just being, well, there are different arguments about which policy instruments to use to get to these targets, but not arguments about whether the targets that we're aiming for or incorporating into, whole of government responses to the climate crisis. It makes it far more politically sustainable. And that's where actually in the US, it's, I think, a lot harder. And the US might be an example that parallels with Australia more directly, where this massive lurch from we're not part of the climate agreement at all, we're outside Paris now, to we're committing to 50% plus emissions reduction targets. And that's a much bigger issue internationally, even in Australia, especially because of just what a consequential player the US is as a global actor in and of itself, but as a contributor to the problem of climate change. That's where there are parallels, I think, in the US context. And it is possible that we will see more lurches over time in the American context, even though we see some similar parallels at the Australian level, in the sense that you have individual states in America who are doing some wonderful work in terms of reducing emissions. The response at the federal government level, if we see a Trump 2024 presidency, is that scary at the international level in terms of what that could signal at a crucial time in terms of climate action. But the UK, I think less so. I think that's more sustainable in part because it's largely bipartisan.
Okay, last question, a quick one.
Quick one. Okay, I'll try this one. It's a local one from a gentleman called Homanas Safi. These ambitious targets set by New South Wales and Victoria to improve climate is imposing lots of money to taxpayers. Do you see any practical evidence of us achieving those targets, or we are better off to go back to fundamentals by giving financial rebates to people to buy electric cars, houses, use solar power, etc.?
In some ways, this is the sort of, it's not quite a carrot or the stick argument, but an incentive system to try to get people to shift versus something that basically just increases the cost. But personally, I'm far more inclined towards sort of taxation-based model where you basically, because that model essentially says there is a cost with climate change. Let's actually find some ways to think about how we incorporate that cost of the effects of climate change itself into, and the contribution to greenhouse gas emissions into the cost of things like the transport of energy, of agriculture, of all of those things. So at that level, I would say I'm less concerned about state governments that are increasing immediate costs associated with these things, because I think actually one thing that has changed, and that has changed for the better, for years in terms of political philosophy, you had people concerned about environmental change and climate change saying it's all the market's fault, the market is driving these things. And now you have this bizarre position in countries like Australia where you are thinking, well, thank God for the market. The market, at least, is saying we're pushing against continued investment in fossil fuels, and that the only way forward is to start this transitional wave, whereas in the past that had seemed to be the argument for sustaining it. So I'm less concerned about state governments intervening in that way. I think you use the levers and the mechanisms that you have at your disposal, and in the process, when we think about the carbon tax, the way in which it actually simultaneously reduced emissions from electricity while actually generating funds for Australian taxpayers, through essentially costing effectively greenhouse gas emissions, as opposed to direct action that had very little effect, but cost taxpayers millions, billions of dollars. That's not the way forward.
Well, thanks very much, Matt. That's been a great contribution. Thank you, everybody, both in the audience here at Holding Redlich. We thank them as very kind sponsors for our contribution, for our meeting here, but also those of you who attended those online. You get a very generous gift from us. You get a free honorary membership free here of the AAQ. We have people knocking the doors down wanting to speak for that very generous gift that you all get for doing it. Can I just outline a couple of things we've got coming up over the next month or so? On next Tuesday, on the 12th of October, Professor Raina McIntyre, her talk, and this is online only, nothing in person, COVID vaccines, variants and the post-pandemic future, which will be a very interesting one. Then on the 9th of November, we have Australia and shifts in the Indo-Pacific by the Chancellor of the University of Queensland, former head of DFAT, Peter Varghese, AC, again, who will be an incredibly interesting and erudite speaker. If you're a member, then on the 19th of October, again at Holding Redlich, we have a welcome back function where we'll supply the food and the alcohol and soft refreshments free of charge, as long as you supply physical presence. So we are looking very subject to numbers. We will only have it on the 19th if we can have everyone here. But if you're a member, you'll be getting an invite from us. And if you're not a member and you're desperate for a drink and a feed, it's not that expensive. And for a student, it's actually very good value for a drink and a feed. But again, thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in tonight and attending. Thanks very much, Matt. And we'll see all the rest of you online on the 12th of October. Thanks very much.